Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the second chapter in the book of Philippians. We're going to begin with the 12th verse, take it all the way through to the 30th. We just want to briefly review what we read earlier in that. Earlier, we read that Paul pleads for them to be united in mind, united in love, and united in soul and in purpose, doing nothing through selfishness or self-conceit, because the element of self-serving or self-exaltation in the mix of a community is bound to upset the equilibrium. So, but in humility, consider others better than yourselves. This is alien to the natural man's calculus. They prioritize themselves at the expense of every other item in nature. But the Christian way is to be different, and we always have before us our model and example, the Messiah, and his sacrifice really puts our own into perspective, because he had and this is borrowed from an incarnational hymn. The incarnation is the doctrine of divinity becoming humanity. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent among men, we read of in John 1:14. He was in the form of Elohim and did not regard equality with Elohim a matter to be grasped. Nevertheless, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and came to be in the likeness of men. So by assuming the flesh, he was functionally subordinate in the plan of salvation and everything else, but he was equal in essence, but he voluntarily surrendered the full array of his divine attributes in order to become a man, and so he had to embrace our physical limitations. He could only be one place at one time, but he was still divine, and so we think, every man has to some extent a God complex. We want to rule our universe, rule our world, set up our own system of morality, but divinity has a human complex, and he came as in the flesh to be our redemption. And he humbled himself and became obedient unto death even on the cross. So that really puts obedience and love into perspective, because self-sacrifice is the supreme example and expression of love, and to obey that. So he had the flesh, and we witnessed the struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane when his flesh longs, is excruciating in agonizing anticipation of the agony it was about to endure. He asked for this cup to pass, but nevertheless not my will, but your will be done. So he is a submissive servant and functionally subordinate, and as such is our model. So we are to model our lives around him. He is the master, we are the disciple, and he will point us to the Father. And because of his obedience, he is richly rewarded by the Father with a name above already every name. And one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess to the name which is above every other name. And so you may not bow your knee down here today, but there's coming a day when you will. You will be forced to bow your knee, and that day we must stand and be reckoned before him. So that is our motivational factor. Now we're just going to get to the lesson itself. Verse 12, so that, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but how much rather in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. So beloved indicates Paul held them, that's an affectionate term of endearment. That's how he called the assembly he was writing. He was writing from a Roman prison to an assembly at Philippi. He had personally evangelized the city. This marks the beginning. This was the birth site of European Christianity. As Christianity developed, it became sort of a white man's religion, but it began as an Eastern one. And, the true test of integrity and sincerity and the moral merits of any man is not what he does when everyone is looking, but what he does when no one is looking. So that, and Paul knows that they are obedience even in his absence. He had no disturbing reports of these false teachers who had crept in and led their assembly astray, as he did in other locations. And he advises and recommends them to work on your salvation with fear and trembling. The thought that we might lose it, I believe one can lose their salvation, and and come to a saving knowledge and then forsake that knowledge, and it is worse off for the one who came to the knowledge and forsook it than it is the one who was ignorant of it to begin with. We read of this in Hebrews 10, 26, 27, and also 2 Peter 2, 20, 21. For it is Elohim who is working in you, both to desire and to work for well-pleasing. So in the 6th verse of the 1st chapter, we read that he is working, and what he begins, he finishes. So he is working out on our progress to perfection. He is working a perfect miracle in us when we are submitted to him, and we remain submitted by doing his will and his desire and to work for well-pleasing. So we are not self-oriented creatures. Remember the early juxt of the 3rd verse, doing nothing through selfishness or self-conceit, but pleasing others, and above all else pleasing Elohim. And sometimes we have to displease and offend humanity in the world in order to please Elohim. And I personally think that Christianity needs to take a more belligerent posture towards sin in society in the world we live in today. Do all without grumblings and disputings. So there's plenty of cause and reason to grumble and dispute, but Paul suggests that you don't have to. So there are the natural man, you get them in a room together, they will inevitably will come up with something to grumble and dispute, but we who are in the church and follow the way ought to know better and do better. So we should avoid useless arguments that are just provocative in nature, and complaining. We can complain, but it's far better to praise when you have cause to complain than to complain. So no matter whether we abase or abound, Paul writes of this in 4:12, I believe, he is enriched and sustains by the grace which was sufficient for him. We read of in 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10, or somewhere thereabouts. In order that you be blameless and faultless, children of Elohim, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and corrupt generation, among whom you shine as the lights in the world. So if we are prone to anger and disputes and hatred and hostilities, then we will not be blameless, and we are to be blameless and faultless. We are to not sin so that the world can use that sin against us. We are witnesses and representatives of the Master himself on earth, and we have to be blameless, and we are made blameless in him in eternity, and we can be made blameless now. But of course, they're always going to make up stuff about us, even when we are sinless. But we are still exist. We exist in the world and for the world, even though we are not of the world. And we are to function as lighthouses. So the entire world is steeped in darkness, which is synonymous symbolically with sin and ignorance. But we are to function as light vessels. And what do we read in the Beatitudes? A city on a hill that cannot be hid. You do not light a lamp and leave it under a concealed table, but you let it shine. So we have to shine for the world because they are lost, and a lot of them are loving it, and some of them just don't know any better. We got to reach out to the ones who's looking for answers and see what we have and show them the way, because it is the way that we are following. Holding on to the word of life for a boast to me in the day of Messiah, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. So Paul is clinging on. He's in prison, remember, and he is still holding on to the words of life. He is writing the words of life, but he is also saturated by the words of life, which give the word is the scripture, and this applies to us. We are to hold on to the word of life, to have a boast. That way we will not be ashamed in the day that Messiah comes. Paul is aware of this fact, perhaps more than most historical Christians, but he knew that he had not run in vain or worked so hard or sacrificed so much or spent sweat, blood, and tears on the journey that he had been called to, because he had the assurance that it was not in vain, and it was for a greater purpose. And Paul's path bears a historical echo and stamp which resonates in our generation and everyone that's come before us and everyone that will come after us. He is the model Christian, Yahshua accepted. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. So rejoicing is best when mutual. When someone fails and you rejoice at that, that's not as satisfactory as you are rejoicing in someone who has succeeded. So that is the type of camaraderie and the bond that is to exist and flourish between Christians in our communities and individually and collectively within that community. But I trust in the Master Yahshua to send Timotheus to you shortly, so that I too am encouraged by news from you. So Timothy is mentioned in the opening verse of the opening passage. That does not mean that he wrote it. It's just that Paul considered him an equal and a friend and a partner enough to include him, and Paul did not personally write it. He dictated it, but he included Timothy in his name. Timothy was his spiritual son, his pastoral protege, and he could always count on him and rely on him. He gives Timothy's report card, and as we read, it is a stellar witness, and we can find out a lot more information in the two pastoral epistles which are written by Paul addressed to Timothy, the second of which comes in his second bout in a prison in Rome. So his final epistle was 68 AD. That's when he was beheaded by the sadistic Emperor Nero, but before that, I actually forgot where I was going, so we're going to move on. For all seek their own, not those of Messiah Yahshua. So remember, this element of selfishness is not to exist or flourish because it will divide and distort and corrupt and compromise the collective mission. So if everyone was like Timothy, unfortunately all seek their own, even in the church, and the church is to be geared and oriented towards the things of the Messiah and the Messiah himself. But if we are self-seeking and seeking our own interest, our own advantages, our own resources, our own gain, our own esteem, our own acclaim, then we are laboring in vain and running in vain too, because it stopped being, it never was about the one who it should be about. It is about us. So as Christians and disciples, we are to be submissive servants, content to give the honor and the esteem and the glory to the one in whose name we minister. But you know he has proven himself that as a son with his father, he served with me for the good news. So he calls the wider audience beloved. This is how he refers to them, but he also considers Timothy a son, a spiritual son. And Paul, of course, was a bachelor. He was not called to marriage. He was married to his work. And he writes extensively about marriage in 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter. But Timothy did function as a surrogate son for a bachelor who never married, and he did serve with him faithfully, honestly, and with results, and he saw a lot of potential in Timothy, and he knew that from his blank slate of submissiveness, there was unlimited growth and potential. Timothy, from the writings, Paul's epistles addressed to him, we can gather that he was a little short on self-confidence. He was young, and he struggled to assert his authority over older people because older people do not naturally submit to younger people, but that's no fault of his own. So I expect to send him as soon as I see how it goes with me. This is neither the first nor the last time that he also entrusted Timothy in the Thessalonian epistles. These were the earliest chronologically written ones before, slightly after Galatians. Then it's the 2 Thessalonians. They were written 6 months apart. And he rejoices, having sent Timothy, he rejoices at his report somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd chapter of the first one. So Timothy had to serve in this capacity. He was a reporter and Paul's eyes and ears in places where he could not be. And remember, even the Messiah was subjected to the physical constraints of the time-space continuum while he inhabited the flesh. And I trust in the Master that I myself shall also come shortly. So he knows he's in prison, but he is liberated, and he has faith that this will not be the end. Nevertheless, he expressed his desire and his willingness to be poured out as a drink offering. This can be interpreted in a martyr's lens, and he comments on the relative merits of life and death in the preceding chapter. And he says in the he debates out loud whether it is better to live and die, and he says to die is gain, but to live is Messiah. So he considered it better to be in his presence, dead, than it was alive. But he had an awareness of his calling, and he had not been called home to heaven yet. He still had work to do, and he was aware. So his trust and his faith was that he would see another day and spread the news more fully than he had. And also in the first chapter, we read that Paul rejoices, even though he is in prison, that the good news is spreading because of his imprisonment. And he expresses an indifference to the motives of the messengers of the good news. The only thing he cares about is that it is going to the ends of the earth. But I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, and your apostle and servant to my need. So this is not to be confused with Epaphras, the one who evangelized or founded the church at Colossus. The Colossus is the one of the prison epistles. It appears after Philippians and most orders, but not in this one. But he called Timothy his son. He called Epaphroditus my brother. So he's approaching him perhaps more equal in age, and he was his fellow worker. So their relationship was as equal and Democrats. They were soldiers in the common struggle of our collective warfare. And he considered him your apostle, and he was the servant to his need. And he came through the rescue. He provided for Paul because Paul was dependent on the charity of others for his provisions, and this Epaphroditus came through to the rescue, as he freely acknowledges in somewhere in the 4th chapter. He acknowledges him once more. But for indeed he was sick, near to death, but Elohim had mercy on him, and not only on him, but as me as well, lest I should have sadness upon my sadness. So even though he was sick, he was not dead, and while there is life, there is hope, and he did not use his near-death sickness to stop or hinder his own walk, because Elohim had mercy on him and implicitly alleviated him from this sickness near death. And that would have been sadness. And Paul already has reasons to be sad. He's in prison. That's not a happy place. That's somewhere no one wants to be. But he couldn't bear the sadness on top of the sadness to know that this man who had rescued him, at least in one emergency situation, should be lingering and struggling with death. But he acknowledges that Elohim has healed him and redeemed him et al., etc. Therefore I sent him more eagerly, so that on seeing him again you might rejoice, and I be less sad. So he wants to show them this example of this person who had stepped in and filled he was looking not only for his own interest, but for the interest of others. That's one we didn't read. That's the 4th verse of this chapter. So he was an example of that principle, and he made sure that Paul was provided for in the course of his ministry and his journey. Receive him, therefore, in the Master with all joy, and hold such a one as he in esteem. So he's telling them when he comes, you got to be glad that he's here and be happy. Put on your smiley faces, put on your happy faces. This is a man who means a lot to me, and I want you to rejoice in his presence. and make sure he is not denied the due deference of the guest of honor. So he may have been affiliated with the Philippi assembly, but he may have, but I think he's also from some other city, but I forget which one. Because for the work of Messiah he was near death, risking his life to fill up what was lacking in your service towards me. So he had not only stepped up to the plate on Paul's behalf, but he had done so because of the neglect of them. So even though this entire collective assembly were too selfish to think of Paul, this one person stepped up and made the difference. And so he's using them to chide them, but he's also telling them to rejoice in his presence, because he's an example of one who is willing to die for the work of the Messiah. He risked his life and made the difference, and did not let the fact that death was near his door, or could have been at any moment, from extending a helping hand in need. And may we also be similarly minded. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.